In this presentation, I will be talking about actions deemed unethical in networking, primarily compromising the privacy of others and linking it to the topic of public security. In networking, unethical actions are to seek to gain unauthorized access to the resources of the networks, to conceal the identity of the user, except where such behavior is explicitly permitted, to disrupt the intended use of the networks, waste resources, for example, personnel, hardware, software, bandwidth, etc., to destroy the integrity of computer-based information, to insult or embarrass other users, and finally, to compromise the privacy of other users. Compromise the privacy of other users. Anyone who seeks to discover something personal about someone else without their permission and then share the information with others is compromising the privacy of the given user. With a few people, it's not as dangerous as when the privacy of millions is compromised. At the greater level, it can be used to model and predict the behavior of the population, and then through targeted information or ads, influence these users. In recent years, the topic of compromising the privacy of others online has become quite significant. In the spring of 2018, it was revealed that a company named Cambridge Analytica, the company that worked on the political campaign of Donald Trump and the Leave EU campaign, which was one of the pro-Brexit parties, had been collecting private data from Facebook users. In the US alone, through around 250,000 users who had explicitly given permission to Cambridge Analytica, Cambridge Analytica was able to access the personal data of up to 90 million people. This data was then used to target certain people in order to make them vote for Donald Trump. Since then, privacy has been addressed, but only in some parts of the world. For example, here in the European Union, a legislation had been passed that aims primarily at giving the control back to individuals over their personal data. Public security versus privacy. The issue of compromising the privacy of others brings up the question of whether public security exceeds the right of people for their privacy. This can be clearly seen when it comes to terrorism. After 9/11, the US passed the Patriot Act, allowing the intelligence agencies and law enforcement to conduct unwarranted searches of homes, phones, emails, and financial records. Most of the provisions set by the Patriot Act were initially set to expire by the end of 2005, but instead they were extended to 2011 and then again by Barack Obama until 2015. In 2015, the Patriot Act was abandoned and replaced by the Freedom Act, which with a few exceptions is de facto identical. This brings up the question of where does one draw the line between public security and privacy? Public security and COVID-19. The question of where does one draw the line between privacy and public security has now become more prevalent than ever in the past decade, with the crisis we are now facing, the COVID-19. Most governments with at least some cases of the virus have either initialized or are in the process of initializing a system of digitally tracing anyone infected, whether it be to enforce quarantines or self-isolation of infected or potentially infected people, or tracing with whom infected people have come into contact with in order to stop the spread of the virus. In China, digital profiling and tracking of people had been extensive even before the spread of the virus. In the past years, China has been testing their social credit system, where depending on the behavior, one can either get a positive or negative credits. Actions that would result in negative credits are, for example, red light violation, jaywalking, playing loud music, or eating on public transport, etc. Actions that would result in positive points are, for example, blood donations or other voluntary. People with negative credit scores would be severely limited. They would be denied any purchases of plane or train tickets, in some cases fined for negative behavior, excluded from school admissions, and they could be put on public display. This, along with the extensive mass surveillance in place, would allow the central government to eliminate any uncomfortable people and set a precedent for people to live a certain lifestyle. During the current crisis, multiple Chinese cities have adjusted negative point behavior to include eating animals such as dogs, snakes, and turtles, affecting prices of medical supplies, and spreading misinformation and hoaxes about the virus. But most importantly, actions that will further spread the virus. For example, people who hide their medical and travel history and thus might spread the virus would have serious point deductions and even risk being put on a blacklist. Some cities have temporarily stopped negative point actions for businesses, such as not paying back loans on time. Israel has for the past 2 decades been facing a wave of terrorism. In a step to fight the spread of terrorism in Israel, the Israeli government has been using personal data, for example, phone tracking, phone call tapping, etc. The Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu revealed that Israel would utilize the technology normally used to fight terrorism in an effort to enforce quarantine and trace citizens potentially infected with the virus. This would mean locating phones of people in quarantine in order to find any violators of quarantine. This measure may seem as an invasion of privacy to the Western world. However, many Israelis have come forward saying that they accept this invasion as a part of everyday life in the fight against an enemy. Whilst the topic of personal data had been discussed before the pandemic broke out, it had all been put aside for the time of the crisis, as most deem public health more significant than privacy. Some may wonder what assurances do people have that authoritarian governments, such as that of China, will take back the measures and not extend them indefinitely in a step to consolidate their regimes and eliminate any uncomfortable elements.